Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're diving into a question I know a lot of us are thinking about these days. Is the U.S. economy heading for a recession? And if it is, what are the warning signs?
Yeah, it feels like everyone's asking that these days. And it's not exactly an easy question to answer.
Yeah, for sure. It's complex. Which is why we're lucky to have your insights today. We're taking a close look at an article by Juan Ignacio Marrón. He's the founder of Inversores, Institucionales, and let me tell you, this article is a gold mine.
It really is. It's thought-provoking stuff. Instead of just fixating on the usual, the inverted yield curve everyone talks about.
Which, let's be honest, can sound a little like gibberish to most of us.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Marrón argues we should be paying closer attention to four key economic variables. He looked at these variables across every recession we've had in the past 70 years.
Well, going way back.
Yeah, and he found some pretty compelling patterns.
So it's kind of like he's reverse engineering recessions. What are the common threads?
Yes, exactly. He's created a sort of recession checklist, you could say, based on historical data.
I'm into it. So what are these magical variables?
Okay, well, the first two are probably familiar to you, the federal funds rate and the unemployment rate.
Okay, those make sense. What about the other two? What are we looking at there?
So the other two might sound a bit more technical, but stick with me because they're really interesting. It's the difference in yields between 10-year and 2-year Treasury bonds.
Okay, already that sounds a little intimidating.
It sounds scarier than it is, I promise.
Yeah,
it's called the 10Y2Y spread for short.
Okay, that's easier.
And then there's the difference between 10-year and 3-month Treasury bonds.
So that's the 10Y3 meter spread.
Exactly. You got it.
See, I'm learning. But why are those spreads so important?
Think of it this way. The bond market, it's like this huge, massive prediction machine. It's always trying to guess the future of the economy. And those spreads we talked about, they're basically telling us how confident that prediction machine, that bond market is about long-term economic growth. So when those spreads narrow or even invert.
Meaning the difference between the rates goes negative. That's basically the bond market sending up a warning flare.
Wow, okay.
And the thing is, the bond market, it's usually right.
So that's a little unnerving. So is Marrón looking at these four variables before a recession is actually declared, not just after the fact?
Exactly. That's what makes this so interesting. Most analyses, they focus on what happens during a recession. But Marrón, he's looking for those early warning signs, the subtle shifts that often slip under the radar. And to make it even easier to wrap our heads around, he created this chart, a visual layout of these four variables over time, and it highlights when recessions occurred.
So we can literally see how these variables behave before, during, and after a recession. That's incredibly helpful for actually wrapping our heads around it.
Right. It makes it so much clearer than just looking at numbers in a spreadsheet. For sure. So it's like he's giving us X-ray vision into the economy. Mm-hmm. What's the first big takeaway from all this historical data?
Well, one of the most fascinating and kind of counterintuitive things Marrón points out is that the federal funds rate, it tends to actually hit its peak before a recession is officially declared, not during.
Really? Okay, that does seem counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Because at that same time, unemployment tends to be, near its lowest point, right?
You got it.
So if unemployment is low, shouldn't things be good? I mean, what's going on there? Why does that happen?
So it has to do with the delayed effect of interest rate hikes. So when the Fed raises interest rates, to combat inflation,
right, it's
basically like tapping the brakes on the economy. It's not an immediate thing. It takes time for those effects to fully ripple through. So even if things look good on the surface, a slowdown, it might already be baked in. Think of it like steering a giant cruise ship, right? You can't just yank the wheel and expect an immediate course correction. It's got all that momentum.
That's a great analogy. It's like we're feeling the aftershocks of those interest rate hikes down the line. So in a way, that low unemployment rate could be a bit misleading.
Exactly.
So what other seemingly obvious signals does Marrón challenge with his research?
Well, he actually takes on a big one, that belief that a recession starts when the yield curve inverts. We've all heard people saying that.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
All the time. It seems like that's the big recession siren.
Right, exactly. But Marrón's analysis, it paints a more nuanced picture.
I am very interested to hear this. Please tell me more.
So he dug into the data. Right, the historical data, and found that while, yes, an inverted yield curve often precedes recessions, it's not the be-all and end-all that people make it out to be. What's actually more reliable is what happens after the yield spread hits its lowest point.
You mean when those spreads, they start widening again after being inverted?
Yes. Exactly.
Okay.
He calls it normalization, basically. And he found it occurred in every single 100% of the historical recessions he analyzed.
Wow, okay.
It's like that moment when, you've stretched a rubber band as far as it can go and then snap.
Yeah, okay.
That's when things can get a little unpredictable.
Gotcha. So, okay, we've got our 4 key variables. We've got some historical context. But how does all of this apply right now? Like, what's Marron's take on the current state of the U.S. economy?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and maybe a little unnerving. When he applies this whole recession checklist, to where we are right now, his conclusion definitely gave me pause.
Oh, you can't leave me hanging like that. What did he find? Are we, on the brink? Is his analysis saying a recession is headed our way?
Well, let's just say it looks like we might be checking off all the boxes on that recession checklist.
Okay, you've got to elaborate on that. Our listeners are on the edge of their seats right now, and honestly, so am I. So let's go through it, point by point. Where do we stand on each thing on Marron's recession checklist?
Okay. Deep breaths. So first up, the federal funds rate. Remember how we said one condition is that the rate is equal to or lower than the recent peak?
Right. And what is it right now compared to that last peak?
So right now, the federal funds rate is sitting at 4.87%. And that recent peak we were talking about, that was 5.33%.
So it's lower. Check. Okay, we're 1 for 1 on this recession checklist. What about unemployment?
All right, so condition number 2 is that the unemployment rate is higher than its recent low point.
Okay.
Well, newsflash.
Yeah.
It is. Unemployment right now is at 4.1%, and that recent low was 3.4%. So
another check mark. Getting a little sweaty over here. 2 for 2 is not exactly comforting.
Okay,
let's talk about those, what were they, yield spreads. What's going on with those?
Okay, so the third condition on the checklist, it's that the 10 Y-to-way spread is higher than its recent lows.
Is this?
It is, big time. It's currently at plus 12.7 basis points, which is way, way higher than its recent low of, get this, netted 108.1 basis points.
Okay, 3 out of 4. At this point, I think I can guess what you're going to say about the last one, but for the sake of, completeness, you've got to tell me. The 10 Y3 meter spread.
Yeah, you guessed it. Higher than its recent low. It's at a negative 52.9 basis points compared to a recent low of negative 192.2.
So all 4 of those conditions, those potential red flags, they're all happening right now.
It appears so, yes.
Okay. So just to be clear, based on all of this historical stuff, based on these patterns, is Marron saying a recession is imminent, it's a done deal?
Well, it's more accurate to say that his analysis seems to be pointing in that direction. We have to remember, this model, it's a tool, a guide. It doesn't predict the future outright.
Right.
So while it's suggesting a higher probability of a recession, it doesn't say anything about how severe it'll be or how long it might last.
Okay. So it's not necessarily about if a recession might hit, but more like when and how hard.
You got it.
Okay. So yeah, that's important. We could still be in for a bumpy ride, but maybe not a total economic earthquake.
Yeah.
I gotta say, though, this feels a little different from what we're hearing from a lot of, big-name market analysts and even from Jerome Powell himself.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of that disconnect?
That's a really good point. And honestly, I think that's exactly why it's so important to, consider different points of view. Economic forecasting, it's not an exact science, no matter how much we might want it to be.
Right. It's like we've got Marron over here saying, hey, watch out. And then we've got other folks saying, everything's fine. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And I think that's exactly why it's so important to be, critical thinkers. We can't just accept what we hear without, digging a little deeper ourselves. Especially when it comes to the economy, things are always changing.
So true. So where does that leave us, our listeners? We've thrown a lot of data at them today, talked about all this analysis. What can someone listening do with this information?
Well, first and foremost, I think it just highlights how important it is to stay informed, Keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the economy. Like they say, knowledge is power.
Love that. Knowledge is power. So it's not about freaking out. It's about, being prepared.
Yeah.
Right? What are some things people can do to be ready if things do get a little rocky?
Exactly. For individuals, it might be a good time to, take a look at your personal finances.
Do a little check-in.
Exactly. Do you have an emergency fund? One that could cover, say, 3 to 6 months of expenses.
I've really been meaning to build up my emergency fund. Maybe this is the kick in the pants I needed.
It's always a good idea to have that cushion, especially if you're feeling a little uncertain about things.
For sure. What about businesses? Anything they should be keeping in mind?
Yeah, I think it's a good time for businesses to, really look at their plans for next year. Like, what happens if people aren't spending as much? Or if borrowing money gets more expensive?
Right.
It's all about thinking about those potential challenges and having a plan B.
Flexibility is key.
Yeah.
So we've talked about what individuals can do, what businesses can do, but what about like policymakers? What's their role in all of this?
Oh man, policymakers have a tough job right now. It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to keep inflation under control, but also trying to avoid a full-blown recession.
That's stressful.
It's a tough balancing act for sure.
No easy answers.
That's economics for you.
Yeah.
It's complicated, and there are always going to be things we can't predict. But hey, that's what makes it interesting.
That's one way to look at it. Okay, so as we wrap up here, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to remember from today's deep dive?
I think the most important thing is that we can't predict the future, but we can be prepared. By understanding the historical patterns, knowing what signs to look out for, and being aware of the potential risks, we can make smarter decisions for ourselves, our businesses, and our communities.
Well said. Being informed, staying adaptable, and maybe having a little emergency fund stashed away. That's the name of the game.
You got it. And hey, who knows? Maybe the sun will come out tomorrow, right?
Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for this awesome deep dive. It's given me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
It was my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the U.S. economy. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more informed we are, the better prepared we'll be for whatever comes our way, good or bad. Keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you next time.